Hey everyone. So, kind of back to this Cain and Abel story, and I've been spending a lot of time there, but it seems like the more that I look at it and the more time I spend in it, it's interesting like how much more comes out of it. It's quite fascinating, and I promised myself I wouldn't go too far in one direction because it's one of those conversations that can sort of can sort of take you into a lot of different avenues, and you find yourself in in these rooms of ideas. But it's quite interesting when I was thinking about the story, and because there's a lot that's left out, and you have to ask yourself the question, is it left out intentionally? Um, was the most important details out that story preserved? And not knowing these things, it leaves you in a place where you have to you have to enter into the world of contemplation a lot. And particularly I was thinking about this because there's so many implications to the things that take place in the story. Particularly, like, what comes to mind first is the question of, was this the first time this happened? Meaning, you kind of start to wonder, was this the first time that Abel and Cain had to both present this sacrifice before the Lord? Was this their coming of age official sacrifice? Because if it wasn't, you kind of have this idea that can take you into the other direction, which is, well, was this the first time that Cain deviated from what the proper sacrifice is, right? Um, or had he deviated before? And I think the answer would probably be no, because if he had deviated before, perhaps we wouldn't find ourselves in this conversation, which kind of makes me think that this is the first deviation, meaning that this was the first time that they were required to do such thing, and this is the first time that he deviated from this. And it's very interesting because then, you by implication, you have this understanding that, well, they knew what they had to do. I mean, Abel didn't just sacrifice the firstborn of his flock just simply because it was the easy thing for him to do, because he was that was his line of work, if you will. And for Cain, his line of work was with the harvest of of nature, the fruits and the vegetables, if you will. And so for him, that was easy to do. So they went into both of those places, and they extracted what each of them saw as the most important. But you don't get that idea, because in the narrative, as God talks to Cain, he says, if you do what is right, will you not be accepted? Which by implication means that he knew what was the right thing to do. And this could take you down the avenue of sibling rivalry, and how that plays itself out in that story. But it also takes you to the idea that to contemplate on was that Abel was familiar with what it meant to take the life of of an animal, and what that represented, and perhaps this sort of struggle and guilt to do such thing, which I think that we sort of think more about in the West as we have more time to think about these things, and also because of the extension of the Christian culture and Christian ideas in the West, that I think even things like veganism and vegetarian, they're not too far off from this idea of what it means to really take life from something, and that there is a sense that there is something not right about this, but it must happen for a particular reason. And I think Abel had a quite good understanding of what that reason was, if you will. And I think that's what I want to explore, which is why Cain's sacrifice could not be accepted, because it was the rejection of the symbolic meaning of the sacrifice. So it's symbolic meaning in sacrifice, and that's why it's significant. So um, you have this notion of the spotless lamb, right? And we'll get into that, what that represents, but more so than that, it's the idea of the spotless sacrifice, and what that means. But if you think about Cain's offering, he missed the symbolic implications. And I think this is the key as to why his sacrifice was not accepted, or at least it's a peripheral understanding of why it was not, you know, accepted. So so he had a prescribed form of sacrifice, right? So, but instead of following the prescribed form of sacrifice, Cain chose to offer the fruits of his labor, right? And there's something to that in the sense that the fruit of his labor, like it's the thing about like the thing about the lamb coming out of the sheep is there's no sort of human intervention in that process, right? It's like this is a process of creation in which you have no part of, in a sense. I mean, I can see the argument to saying that there is, but realistically, I mean, it all takes place within the body of the animal and the relationship between two animals. But with the fruits and the vegetables, yes, though they do appear themselves in nature, it requires cultivation, and we know that it requires a sense of planning and plowing and plotting to be able to kind of have this manifest. And so, in a sense, it's like my there is like this idea of the individual's work in there versus an individual's righteousness by faith, if you will, right? So there, yes, yes, okay. So it wasn't just a simple mistake in Cain's situation, right? It represented a deeper deviation, and I think that's kind of the point. So by creating his own version of the sacrifice, Cain disregarded the symbolic lessons that the correct sacrifice was meant to teach. His offering could not replace the original sacrifice because it lacked the profound meaning and intention required for true atonement. So it's like, here you go, like I will present to you something peripheral to what you have asked me, but with my spin on it. And then the point is that you cannot teach what that represents, or the individual cannot understand the full capacity of the lesson if they choose to manipulate something in a way that they see as correct, right? And so by extension of that, psychologically, Cain's act signifies an attempt to establish his own system of morality, independent of the transcendent one given by God. So, and it's not a far-fetched idea. And it's very implicit in the story because, I mean, if you think about what the knowledge of good and evil is, which is basically, I mean, in its simplest form, the knowledge of good and evil is the knowledge, the ability for an individual outside of God to decide for himself what is morally right and what is morally wrong. So it's the creation of my own sort of universe with its own forms of rules for it to govern itself in the way that I see to govern itself and its moral structure, if you will. And in a sense, that's what the serpent, the Satan, was proposing to the fathers, which was the idea that if you eat of this fruit, what it represents, it's not the fruit itself, but it's what the fruit represents. The fruit itself represents a deviation from the established in its understanding and meaning to a new form of establishment that the individual itself can create. And then the question becomes, can an individual create that thing outside of God, right? So Cain's sacrifice was a massive deviation from divine instruction and created a world where personal judgment supersedes divine wisdom. So there was an inversion of this idea that the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom, which is the idea that the recognition of that which is on the highest makes you be at a level of humility because you understand that you do not know everything, and that everything that you do know can easily be wrong tomorrow, and that everything that you do know is nothing in comparison to that which the transcendent can know. So there's that. So when we ignore or redefine the symbolic meaning of actions and rituals, we risk reducing them to meaningless gestures, and I think that's what we see in the West. Like what we see in the West is because we think that nothing has meaning, because we've stripped the meaning out of so many things and the purpose of rituals and why we do them, particularly like as you think about even modern Christianity with its kind of positioning towards things like the Sabbath, if you will, where it's like they took all the ritual symbolic nature that was woven into it, and they have remastered it into something that just approximates a vacation in the middle of the week, but it lacks the symbolic representation, which then in and of itself becomes just another day. And that's exactly what it's happened. And that's what we see in the West. Everything has just become just another day. And so this is why Cain's sacrifice could not be accepted. It failed to convey the essential lessons of atonement and redemption. And so, like, how can we take this in for today? Well, I mean, Cain's story teaches us the importance of understanding and respecting deeper meanings behind our actions, right? It's like, why do we shake hands with people when we just meet them? Why do we give hugs? Why do we do these things? And we've kind of entered into the world that these things don't need to be done, and there isn't a structure to the setup at the dinner table, and there isn't a special seat. Um, there isn't a pattern in which something should be done. And by removing the pattern in which something should be done, then essentially what you do is you take away the possible behavioral and psychological and spiritual implications of those things, which in essence can give you well, a deeper sense of happiness, a deeper sense of orientation, um, a structure from which um, to pursue life by, that will provide the least negative psychological distress. We can think about it that way. So that's something to consider from the situation with Cain and why his sacrifice could not be accepted. And you know, furthermore, there is something that I wanted to say to that, which is the idea of atonement, right? Because what does it mean, and why did it have to be why did it have to be this spotless lamb, right? And so when you think about atoning, right? Okay, so the difference between Cain's sacrifice and Abel's sacrifice is that one had the shedding of blood, right? One resulted in death, and one did not contain all of that which this contains and which this represents. And you know that there's that biblical extension of the idea that without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sin. Right. So his sacrifice could Cain's sacrifice could not be representative of an atonement because it lacked what an atonement represents. So true atonement requires emotional with for hurting someone emotionally, like let's use that as an example. True atonement would require a genuine remorse and empathy. So what does that mean? Well, that means that the person seeking forgiveness must fully recognize and feel the impact of their actions on the other person, right? And so the intention behind seeking forgiveness must be sincere and devoid of any self-serving motive. So that's the idea of a spotless sacrifice. An apology that comes from a place of genuine understanding and empathy is akin to the spotless sacrifice. It's not just a superficial act to elevate one's own guilt, but it is a heartful attempt to make amends and heal that relationship. And there is an element of self-sacrifice within there that is very important. So in a sense, the concept of the spotless sacrifice for true atonement points to the importance of true intention and genuine remorse and personal sacrifice, the commitment to change. And these are many of the things that Cain's sacrifice lacked. And another reason why it could not be accepted, you can sort of imagine Abel in the sacrifice, what he was doing and taking that life of the lamb, there's this sense of, there's this sense of guilt associated with it and remorse. But and maybe that is what true sacrifice and atonement entails. It requires that level of it requires that level of deep reflection and understanding of what we are atoning for and why I must sacrifice. And that's that recognition of, in this context, it's the recognition of the pervasive nature of sin and its implications for humanity. So, anyways, those are just some ideas of why Cain's sacrifice cannot be accepted. There's so much more to this story, but I just wanted to leave it with that and share that with you guys today.